Alrighty. Let's do this. Alrighty. Hello, my name is Bailey Frost. I am the Group 10 from the PM class, and today I'm going to talk about the subsonic aircraft watershed accidents and specifically feeder airlines. So what is a watershed accident? So in review, a watershed accident, and specifically an aircraft accident, is an aircraft accident that causes some sort of a change, a shift in the culture and the industry, whether it be positive or negative. As spoken in class, there are 3 different types of watershed accidents in the aircraft industry. There's a procedural accident, which is caused by the human or some sort of pilot error. There's also an engineered accident, which is just poor design. And then there's a systemic watershed accident, which means something was overly complex. We will be talking about 2 of the 3 today. Okay, so let's talk about the ValueJet 592 crash. So this airline was part of a low-cost market, and they participated in something known as cost cutting. So any way they can, they're going to find ways to cut costs. So that means they didn't have any hangars. They paid the crew members as minimally as possible. They only got paid for completed flights. Cabin crew only received basic training. Overall, between 1993 and 1996, the company had 129 emergency landings. The plane itself that we're going to talk about had 2 aborted takeoffs and 8 emergency landings with ValueJet. The plane was called the 904 Victor Juliet, and the plane was 27 years old. So in the cockpit of the flight DC-9 was pilot Candy Kuick and First Officer Richard Hazen. They both had thousands of hours of experience under their belt. So that wasn't a problem. This was not one reason why this is not considered a procedural accident, is they had plenty of experience. So the flight was initially delayed for repair. And then on the flight, you had passengers, you had luggage, and then you had company-owned material. This company-owned material had part of it was airplane parts, and then the other part of it were these 4 boxes. They were labeled as empty oxygen canisters. They were actually chemical oxygen generators that were not empty in the slightest. This was meant for an emergency oxygen supply for passengers in case of emergency. And this contained explosive material, and that explosive material was because of the generator that was supposed to help generate the oxygen for the passengers in case of emergency. These canisters are supposed to have a safety pin and a cap, and it did not. The subcontractor was SaverJet, which is very important, and will come into play later. But instead of trying to find a cap and safety pin, the head mechanic thought that it would be a good idea to use duct tape instead, and that would be sufficient. And to say the very least, it was not. The plane did not have a fire detection equipment in the case of a fire. Instead, it had an airtight seal, which, as you will see at the end of the day, did not serve as any help. So let's talk about the crash itself. There were a total of 110 passengers and crew members on board the flight. It was about 10 minutes into takeoff when smoke began to fill the passenger cabin. Then there was a loud bang, which the pilots and all of the passengers heard, and that's when panic started to set in. Turns out that the canister had been triggered during initial ascension. First, the canisters burned through all of the control cables, leaving the pilots with no control. And the plane went down. There was nothing that they could do about it because the control panels were out and the cockpit was filling with smoke. The plane ended up landing in the Francis S. Taylor Wildlife Sanctuary in the Everglades. The plane was recorded at going approximately 500 miles an hour, which unfortunately meant that there were no survivors left at the site of the crash. So after the crash, ValueJet got grounded on the 16th of 1966. That unfortunately did not last very long. The plane was allowed to fly again on the 30th, obviously not the same plane, but the model of the same year. The company was not criminally charged. The company actually ended up merging with AirTran, who then merged with Southwest Airlines in 2014. The SaberTech maintenance supervisors and the two mechanics were charged with conspiracy and making false statements, but one unfortunately left the country. The company ended up having to pay $2 million in fines and $9 million in restitution. Looking back, obviously, this was considered a systemic accident. This accident could have been avoided if it weren't for the careless mistakes that were made by the mechanics. This was not a failed airplane or pilot error. They were unfortunate casualties that had to go down with a simple mistake. It was an overly complex and failed system. A combination of greed and inattentiveness caused the death of 110 innocent lives. Where was the FFA when this was taking place, or before when these mistakes were being made? Fantastic question. Not so sure. But at the end of the day, there were dozens that failed at their job, and only 3 were fired, and 1 fled the country. So, when it comes to ethics and morality and this crash specifically, it took 5 weeks to get the plane grounded, which of course, like I said, on the 30th, back up in the air. The only reason that it was able to get grounded in the first place was because of the obvious outrage in the public and those who lost their loved ones. There were only 3 FAA inspectors for the entirety of ValueJet, and yet they still failed at their job, and these lives were still lost. They attempted to downplay the accident, but they were eventually blamed. But yeah, at the end of the day, it comes down to greed. There was poor pay for mechanics and other personnel, which could have played a role in the reason why the mechanics were so lazy and didn't do their job well. But at the end of the day, it came down to greed for money, and that lost the lives of 110 innocent people. Moving on, we have the Colgan Air flight number 3407. This was on the 12th of February in 2009. There were a total of 49 passengers and crew members, and the flight was scheduled to go from Buffalo to Newark. The crash was the biggest issue, but something that was very important and was huge in the media and the press when this was all taking place after the crash was how they made it look like it was a continental flight when in reality it was not. This was a quote. It said, this was a quote by one of the lost lives' boyfriends. He said, everything on the paper made it look like this was a continental flight, until lo and behold, in very small writing on the bottom of the paper, there was a statement that read, Continental Flight 3407 operated by Colgan Air as Continental Connection. So what they managed to do was they managed to make the passengers believe and everyone else believe that they were on a continental flight. They were having continental flight safety and service when in reality they were not. Colgan Air introduced this new sort of model, and it's known as code sharing, where regional airlines can carry like the same ticketing code and the color and all of those things and make it look like one thing, but it's the same as the major airline, and it's in reality something entirely different. So for this flight, we've got Captain Marvin Renslow. He ended up only having 618 hours of flight hours logged, which is half the time that is required by most airlines in the United States. It was found after the crash that the captain had 5 failed performance tests and yet was still put in the air. His first officer was a woman named Rebecca Shaw. She was only 24 years old. Rebecca made less than $16,000 in her first year with Colgan Air. It was reported that she was feeling under the weather the night before. She spent the entire night commuting from Seattle to Newark. It was found in translation that Rebecca had said, if I call in sick now, I've got to put myself in a hotel until I feel better. Looking back, another ethical problem, she's not getting paid enough. Therefore, she's willing to make that travel. She doesn't want to call in sick. She doesn't want to take all of these precautionary steps because she can't afford it. And there were also multiple counts of yawning in the transcript when reviewed. So the crash itself. So initially, it was believed that the crash was caused by icing. It all started, the engine stalled, and the pilot and the first officer had a very poor response and made multiple errors, likely due to lack of hours and experience, as well as fatigue and feeling under the weather. So what this mistake was when the engine started to stall was, rather than pushing on the wheel in response to the stall error, the pilot actually pulled on the wheel, which is the opposite, obviously, of what you are supposed to do. The first officer, Rebecca, in response, then put the flaps up on the plane, which, of course, only ended up making matters worse. The pilot lost control and the plane crashed into a home in Buffalo. Unfortunately, no one made it out alive, including an individual that was residing in the home that was crashed into. Looking back, this crash was entirely preventable. This was pilot error. There were multiple different factors, of course, that played into the reasoning for the crash. There was the poor response to the stall. There was far less adequate training required. There was pilot fatigue, poor pay, and lack of situational awareness. And for these reasons, this is considered a procedural incident. So ChatGPT. ChatGPT, to me, this is the most time I've ever spent with ChatGPT was doing the essay and the presentation, and it has been super interesting. I've gained a lot from it. I've learned that it is extremely impressive form of artificial intelligence. It uses grabs these information from all these databases in a matter of, milliseconds, and it regurgitates it back based off of whatever question you post to it. While ChatGPT provided me with tons of information in a matter of seconds, and accurate information as well, if it was based off of logic and fact. But it was clear that the engine struggled when I asked it questions that required more a form of critical thinking or opinion and emotion, which was super interesting. The more questions I asked it, though, surrounding the watershed events, you could tell that the artificial intelligence was starting to adjust and regurgitate basically better answers than the previous ones. When asked specifically on the watershed ethical and moral implications, I asked ChatGPT, what sort of moral and ethical implications did the Colgan 3407 crash and the ValueJet 592 crash bring to light to the public regarding the airline sector? It gave me paragraphs and paragraphs of information, but in summary, it spoke on the aviation standards, safety standards, lack of corporate responsibility, the government oversight played a large role, victims' right and support, and learning and preventative measures. When I asked ChatGPT on categorical imperative, I specifically asked, do you think that these watershed accidents go against Kant's beliefs and ideas surrounding the categorical imperative? In response, it said, from a Kantian perspective and the principles of the categorical imperative, incidents like plane crashes, especially those resulting from negligence, inadequate safety measures, or failure to uphold ethical responsibilities, would likely be considered as violating ethical principles. In review, after learning all of this from research class and ChatGPT, of course, at the end of the day, I do really believe that both of these watershed accidents, as well as other accidents that have and may continue to take place, comes down to greed for money and power specifically. These airlines are clearly willing to take these high risks and put all of their crew members and passengers' lives on the line, even if it means, at the end of the day, because it means that they can make and save more money. These incidents are just examples of when risk indeed overcame the reward. Thankfully, there is a silver lining to all of this. As these harsh realities of corporate greed come to light, changes in the airline industry are being made to help raise the standard of flying. And one can only hope at the end of the day that we don't need to lose any more lives than we already have in order to make a point and make changes. Thank you so much for listening, and have a good day.